Welcome back to Restauranttopia. We're talking about you want to buy a restaurant. How do you do it, and how do you negotiate the terms? Got Julie Toth, formerly Julie Vaccarelli.
Imagine a perfect world where you can build a restaurant, open the doors, and make loads of money. Unfortunately, those days are over. It takes great leadership, hard work, and long hours to operate a successful restaurant. Together, we can make it happen. This is Restauranttopia.
Hi, Julie. How you doing?
I'm good, Brian. How are you today?
Oh, fantastic. So we get to the point when you're negotiating a restaurant purchase. You've found a potential target that you want to acquire. You have a willing seller. How do you memorialize the terms before you take them to the attorney, before you get 50 pages, all the ancillary documents that go along with the purchase agreement? What do you typically advise your clients?
So the most efficient way to do that is to come up with a term sheet where you're going to have all of the terms of the sale listed kind of in a manner that makes everything plug and play for your attorneys or your advisors.
And what I found in my experience is once you do the term sheet, you get a lot of the disagreements, the clarity on the issues. So there's less fighting later on. The purchase price is just one of several aspects of a deal, but there's other poison pills in there that can prevent a deal from closing.
Absolutely. The term sheet, you negotiate up front. These are your business terms. So your advisors can be involved, but certainly don't have to be at this point. While price is really important.
Oh, yeah.
There's a ton of other terms in there, right? How are you going to finance this deal? Is it going to be a cash deal? The seller going to finance some of it? You're going to talk about the time period you have to make the deal. So you're going to want to talk about what specific assets you're going to purchase, if you're going to take any liabilities, the timeline for any diligence. You need to look into a company. You need to look into their finances and what they've been doing all these years to know what you're actually purchasing and where the pitfalls are.
So before we get to the term sheet, I want to talk about the difference between, and this is something that I think is a little bit confusing to most people, most non-lawyers, is what's the difference between a stock purchase agreement where you're buying the entire company and an asset purchase agreement where you're buying the entire company?
In an asset deal, you're buying exactly that. You're just buying assets. What that doesn't come with are liabilities unless you agree upon them. In a stock deal, you're buying everything. So any liability, any lawsuit that could possibly be out there, you're buying a lot of things that you didn't.
You're buying a lot of things that you don't necessarily want.
That's correct. But what you're buying is other people's mistakes.
Oh, couldn't agree more. And I think one thing, the difference, it's a distinction with a slight difference, almost, because you can still buy the name if you do an asset purchase agreement. You still buy all the websites and all the IP. But what you're doing is you're trying to alleviate yourself from some of the liability and potential downside risk down the road. I can give you a great example of whether it's employment claims, whether it is agreements that the seller forgot to tell you about that he entered into under his company name. So you're going to spin up a new LLC that is going to own these assets, and that will basically not have any of the potential exposure that the former company did.
Right.
I've found, and correct me if I'm wrong if you've seen this. So when I'm dealing with one of our Hillcrest customers that want to buy, say, a 2-unit restaurant group, that the purchase price is so critical, but also the deal terms. Like, is it a cash deal versus an earnout? Have you seen a lot of earnouts, and can you explain that to our audience, what that entails?
So I have seen a lot of earnouts, less and less lately though, and I don't know the reason for that. Okay, so what an earnout is you'll get paid some of your purchase price up front, but then there's this earnout term, and what that means is you're going to get paid at some later time based on the business's performance during some finite period of time. So you don't get all your money up front. You're kind of banking on the business doing well to get the rest of your money, and you will either receive it or not based on that at a later date.
I've seen that several times, and I've also seen where you have seller finance. Have you seen a lot of seller finance?
I see a ton of seller financing. So
seller finance, in my understanding, or at least what I've seen in the past, is say you have a a $400,000 purchase price, and then $200,000 is a note that the seller carries. He would get $200,000 as a downstroke at closing, and then he gets a stream of cash flows over a certain amount of times, maybe 3 years, 5 years, of the remaining $200,000. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
That's exactly right. I see that a lot when employees purchase businesses that don't have the resources to cover the entire purchase price. So the seller will finance the remainder, typically like a retirement plan annuity for the seller.
Mm-hmm. And what I've seen is to offset some of that risk, maybe increase the purchase price a little bit to give that seller potential upside, so to speak.
Certainly it comes with a premium. You could also take a security interest in the assets you're selling and protect yourself that way as well.
No, absolutely. In a situation where you own the building and you're only selling the business, I think you have a lot more protection there.
Oh, absolutely.
On our sample term sheet that we'll have on restauranttopia.com, purchase prices on there. Is that something that when you're dealing with clients that they're coming to you with a predetermined purchase price, or is that a multiple of the EBITDA, or how does that usually look?
Typically, they come to us already with the purchase price. Remember, we're the lawyers, so they might have dealt with one of their other advisors on purchase price, either a CPA or someone like that. But the purchase price is kind of a moving target because you haven't seen all the financials yet. You haven't seen all the due diligence yet. So based on what you see once you're in due diligence and what comes to light during that time, that purchase price can move one way or the other.
So if you find something that it may not be very flattering for the success of the company, that there's, maybe it has seasonality that was not represented when the parties were talking, or that there is a downward trend in the restaurant sales.
That's exactly right. Those are your adjustable issues.
So Julie, we're throwing around the word due diligence. Explain what you've seen as the process of that.
Okay, basically due diligence means you have a specified time period where you get to ask for all of the documents and all the information about the company that you need to look at to make an informed decision on purchasing. So you ask for the documents, ask questions about the employees, ask for tax returns, all of those things.
Point of sale data.
Correct. Liabilities, lawsuits, all of those things come out in the due diligence period.
And we just recently did an episode with a listener question, a guy out of Buffalo who was selling 3 units. And I put together a packet that you can download from restauranttopia.com that has basically some just starter due diligence questions and items that you need to get together to get your house in order if you're the seller. But it also works well if you're the buyer because it gives you something as a list of things you want to request.
Oh, that's perfect, too, for the seller, because sometimes sellers don't have an idea of what's going to be asked for, what's going to be requested by the buyer. So if you have a list for them to take a look at, year 2, 3 years out from selling, you can really get your house in order.
And I think it's so important because if you're fearful that they're going to find something during due diligence, let's be honest, it's going to happen regardless. So how can you make sure that that they're going to see that your operation is running efficiently, that you have systems in place, and that when they take over, they can project that those cash flows will be similar, if not better, from their running of the operation?
That's right. And you certainly want to be as open as possible during due diligence because everything does come out. So that's a good point.
Or it comes out after the fact and then there's litigation.
Correct. So we like to avoid.
So let's talk about what you're buying. So when you're buying a restaurant, you're really looking at the name, the location, the furniture, the kitchen equipment. But I will tell you, when you're buying a restaurant, there's not a whole heck of a lot there versus other businesses that you might buy. So that's one reason I think that the price is a little bit lower if the property is not included. If the property is included, then that's a total game changer. But if you just have a location that essentially has a lease, then you're not going to pay a ton for this because all you're doing is buying an obligation to pay rent for the next decade.
Yep, I agree with that because the assets probably aren't worth a ton of money without someone actively using them.
Correct. Yeah, no, I love that. But I will say it's a good idea to buy a restaurant versus trying to build one because you have existing customer base. You hit the ground running. The actual expense to do a build out, as we all know, is super expensive. The efficiencies there to replicate what the person has is real value. It's just maybe not what it would be if it was brand new.
Sure.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is, trying to articulate is, there is a little bit of a discount there.
Yep, I agree with you.
Julie, one thing I think is so important because it has all the downside risk is the liabilities. Some of the liabilities that I'm seeing that you're going to take as part of the asset purchase agreement is obviously the lease. If there's any contracts for any services that you want to keep, so if there is a cleaning company, you want to maybe transfer that liability over to the new buyer. Some excluded liabilities, though, could be if you're using a national food service vendor and you want to go to a good local food service provider like Hillcrest Foods.
Hillcrest Foods, right?
Yeah, so you're not going to take any of the liability on that, or if that is someone put a loan with Cisco or something like that, like you're not going to take on that liability. So that would be some excluded liabilities that I would see, or phone system, point of sale systems that you don't want. Those would be some things that I would look at to exclude the liability for.
Yeah, those are excellent points, Brian.
I know you got to say it. I got to say it without me laughing over top of it.
Those are excellent points, Brian.
One thing that I always put in these term sheets when I'm helping clients out is the broker. If there's a broker involved, I want to make sure that it's noted in there and who's paying for the broker. Or if there's no broker involved, I want to make sure I say that also.
Yes, I do that as well, and that'll translate over into any purchase agreement that you draft.
Yeah, because I'm seeing some of these brokers are getting aggressive in going after people. So if you have a client that is selling their restaurant, they signed up with a broker, and then they sold it themselves, that broker's still going to get a fee, just like if it was your house.
That's exactly right.
Timing, to me, is so important with a seller. I'm seeing anywhere between 90 to 120 days for the lawyers to get everything done, get all the title work done if there's a piece of property involved. What are you seeing as far as closing timeframes?
So that's going to depend on how the purchase price is being financed. If it's a cash deal, it goes a lot faster than if you need bank financing. And certainly if you're buying the real estate that goes with it, you're on real estate timing at that point, rather than, commercial transaction timing.
I think one thing that I advise sellers is patience, because it's going to take longer than you think, and not to mentally check out, because this process, it may not go through.
That's right. It is not a sprint. It is most certainly a marathon.
I was just talking to an operator yesterday out of Maine, and he had been approached by someone to buy his restaurant. It didn't actually go through, and he kind of checked out, and then he got like 5 other offers, ended up getting close with one of them, shutting down the restaurant, and then that one didn't go through, and then the first one ended up coming back to the table. But it's shocking that you got to operate this business like you're not selling it. You got to operate this business like it's an ongoing concern, and essentially that's also what the buyer wants. They don't want you to hiccup or hesitate.
It's very important. It's very important, because until you're at the point of closing, you certainly don't know if the deal is going to close. I've had a number of deals span over a few years. Same buyer, not the same buyer, different buyer, first buyer comes back, and ultimately I had one where my seller never sold. So you have to run your business like it's still going to be your business.
Yeah, and I also think confidentiality is a key thing here. Don't tell your buddies you're selling your restaurant. Don't tell your employees. Treat this thing as it is an ongoing concern and that you're not selling, because you want that operation to continue to tick.
I agree with that. You don't tell people until they need to know. Mm-hmm. And that's typically the absolute last minute.
I've seen, and again, I'm not buying restaurants, but I'm buying businesses. We do not tell employees until we close. And then there's typically a PR thing around that along with the employees. Because one thing that I've seen in the restaurant side of things in my past life as an attorney is when a person sells, there is a perceived difference. And if you can lessen that, it's better. Ever since Jimmy bought the pizza place, the pizza tastes different. And I guarantee you he did nothing different. So it's
right.
like, but it's that perceives like, oh, because Tom's no longer there, or Jan's no longer there, like the pizza tastes different. It's like, no, it doesn't. That's just all in your head.
Right.
And the head of the consumer, but you don't want to have that issue come up. Let's talk about key employees. What are you doing to kind of make sure that key employees go with the company or that they're taken care of? Are you seeing any moves on the side of sellers and buyers to protect that?
So, of course, right, you have certain employees that help run the business more efficiently than if they were not there. Those are the employees you want to keep. They're going to get a premium for that. They're also going to know about the deal prior to closing, because you have to lock in those key employees with employment agreements. Those employment agreements are typically negotiated where the key employee is going to get a chance to look at it ahead of time and decide, is this something that I want to enter into. Confidentiality extraordinarily important, especially with those people, because they are going to be given the heads up.
And I think this is an opportunity for both sides, the buyer and the seller, to solidify maybe a bonus structure or something where they get a little, I don't want to say piece of the action because I don't think you need to give ownership, but at least a bonus, like, hey, here's a retention bonus. Here's $2,000 on the front end, and I'm going to give you $5,000 if you stay for the next 12 months, to help with that transition. And I see especially in multi-unit owners, if you got 5 restaurants with 5 GMs and you lose 2 of them, I mean, what you just bought was a big freaking headache.
Yes. That's exactly right. The front end bonus and the back end bonus, very important. And I see that a lot when there are so few key employees to a business and the business is counting on those employees to stay. It's one of those areas, where money talks. So
it does, but also I've seen, whether they could buy it or not, that there's some hurt feelings because they weren't picked to buy the business.
Oh, sure. I never thought of that. In that scenario, yeah, I really didn't think of it that way.
And especially when you have a strong, you have a strong owner and she's run this business for, 30 years and she wants to sell. And it's like, they're really working for her. They're not so much working for XYZ company. They're working for Jan and her business model, and the employees know that she cares about them. So to be able to transfer that aspect of it, and that's one thing I've talked about in a past episode, is does the business run if you're not there? And that's how you need to make sure that your operation is continuing on, that if you have a really strong operation without you, that's a sellable enterprise. That's a sellable restaurant. If you have an operation that falls apart the moment you land in Florida and you live in Cleveland, like that's a much harder thing to sell. So getting your ducks in a row and making sure that your operation is efficient and well run is very, very important.
Now, some of the things that I see in my practice are the owner will actually stay on for some period of time to transition those relationships and to be part of that larger transition, that goodwill, even with vendors. I don't know if you've seen that.
I see that a lot on the when I'm buying a business, because you have an owner who, if I'm buying a distribution business and, he knows all of the seafood providers, he knows all of the customers. So we like to see a long transition period from, 6 months to a year to a couple of years. But that's on maybe a different scale, but it's not unreasonable for someone to stay around for 60 days or 90 days if it's maybe on a less capacity. Maybe it's just a weekly meeting. Maybe it's that they sit on your board if this is a multi-unit operation. So there's a lot of things that you can do to help transition, but ultimately what you want to do is, as the seller, you want to set up that buyer for success. You want to make sure that they are successful, because that will avoid litigation. They'll make sure that you get paid back if there's an earnout. They'll make sure that if you're carrying paper that you get paid back. And also, you want to take care of your employees, the ones that stayed, the one that helped you build what you were just able to sell. You want to make sure that they're taken care of and that their jobs are secure.
Yep, all good points. Yeah. So one of the other things you want to make sure that is in the term sheet, and you want to make sure that you're purchasing, is the intellectual property. The name of the restaurant is very important. Any trademarks of a restaurant or even a business are very important. And nowadays, you want all the social media. Yeah, you want to make sure you're transferring the ownership and the admin ownership to that social media, so that once you're the owner, you can continue on those platforms.
And this is an area that I've seen so much turmoil and heartache about, because someone's cousin sets it up and then you sell the restaurant, and then all of a sudden you have no access to your Google My Business or your Facebook page, and people are leaving reviews, or you just want to update the photos and you have no access. Like, Mark Zuckerberg's not sitting around in California waiting for you to call him. They're like, hey, customer service, what can we do here? Make sure that you have this stuff and really put it on an onus on the seller to get their house in order and get passwords and get you access to this stuff for closing, because you're going to want to take immediate access to that substance.
Yeah, that certainly should be a closing deliverable in your purchase agreement.
To me, it's almost like the lease. Making sure that you have a lease locked in place with multiple renewals is so important. And as I talked about in past episode, a good seller will have locked in already with the landlord a multi-year, multi-renewal lease. But sometimes I've seen it that as a condition of closing that you have to negotiate with the landlord because they want to know who they're getting in bed with now, and that they're entering into a new lease.
Sure, and you're going to have to review the lease during the diligence to know whether or not that lease is assignable, or you are going to be negotiating a new lease.
Or you just bought something that you have no space for it to go into.
Right. That you want to avoid that.
No, I have seen landlords get very upset if they feel left out and very emotional about not being a part of the process until the very end. So
that's tricky too. That is a tricky timing issue, because you don't want to let the landlord know too far in advance, but you're right. They want to know who their tenant is going to be. And so
I would say if you don't have a long-term lease locked in, then it is a tricky issue. If you have a long-term lease locked in, then I think you are more likely to get the warm and fuzzies from the landlord, but he still is going to want to underwrite the new tenant before he lets you off the hook, if he'll even let you off the hook on the lease.
That's exactly right. So one thing a seller needs to be mindful of is that any responsibilities that are transferring to the buyer, the seller needs to be released from those responsibilities. And that can be a closing deliverable as well.
Yeah, no, and it typically is. One other condition of closing or item that I always see in these things is the liquor license. And in Ohio, at least, you're going to close on, May 1st. That liquor license may not transfer for another 60 to 90 days. So there's a document called a management agreement that allows you to operate that restaurant with the liquor license under the former owner's name. That's
a very important agreement. You're at the mercy of the liquor license board.
100%. And you may want to also hold some money back because the transfer may be held up because the seller still owes $20,000 on taxes, or there's some sort of issue out there. And conversely, while it's transferring, the buyer could also incur liability for you in the sum of $20,000 that he's not paying his bills right off the rip. So that's something that you really want to talk through with your attorney. Make sure you have this agreement in place, and then also put some money in escrow. Because if there's money in escrow, at least it helps everyone know that you don't have to sue over it, or there's no risk exposure, because it's very, very difficult to sue over $20,000.
That's exactly right. And so when you have it in escrow, you know it's available.
Yep.
And that's a very easy way to limit your liability.
I think people misunderstand that you can go to court and win, but you still lose if you have $50,000 in attorney's fees.
That's certainly correct.
So, Julie, as we're kind of wrapping this up, what are some of the other things that maybe I missed that you would include in a term sheet? Really helps facilitate negotiation and get a deal closed.
So I would certainly include confidentiality, and I would also include an exclusivity period. It's a finite period of time where these two parties negotiate only amongst themselves. No other offers are entertained. And that gives the buyer and the seller both some assurances that they're negotiating in good faith.
I like that. Yeah, I have typically seen, again, we're at the term sheet part of the negotiations, not at the purchase agreement part. but I've seen them be non-binding or have basically a binding agreement with some outs, because you never know if you're still in due diligence, what you're going to discover, if the financials show something else, or, something else comes out of the woodwork that would cause this not to be a good transaction for one or both of the parties. I like that exclusivity because that good faith feeling is so important, that you have a willing buyer, but just as important, I see this because you're selling something that's so, I don't know, sentimental is the right word, but it's someone's blood, sweat, and tears, that you have a willing seller. That willing seller and willing buyer is how a deal gets closed. But I'm not trying to make light of it. It's still very emotional.
Yeah, it's very emotional, especially if it's a family business. If the owners have been operating it themselves for a certain period of time, emotions come into this.
It's so true. So, Julie, where can people get a hold of you at?
So I'm an attorney for Wickens, Herzer, Panza in Avon, Ohio, and we help owners and buyers complete transactions. If you're thinking about buying or selling, give me a call.
All right. And you handle restaurant transactions?
I do.
Awesome. I really appreciate everyone's time today. Julie, thank you so much for coming in at the Hillcrest Studios. If you want to download my sample term sheet that I've used in the past for when I was a full-time lawyer, go on to restauranttopia.com, and it's right there in the resources page. But thank you so much. I appreciate your time. I know this is an emotional journey for both the buyer and the seller, and I hope this helped out a little bit. So have a great day. And if you got any questions, reach out to me or Julie. And this is a high-quality pod. Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Adios.
Thank you for listening to Restaurantopia. The gratitude that we have for each and every one of you spending your precious time to listen to this podcast is immeasurable. Please make sure to tell a friend about this podcast. And also, if you have any feedback for us, visit us on restauranttopia.com and drop us a line. You can also subscribe on your favorite place to listen to podcasts. Thank you and have a great day.
We are excited to announce the Restauranttopia VIP Text Club. Join by texting the word podcast to 844-928-4257. You will get access to exclusive content, industry news, deals, announcements, pro tips, and more. The VIP Text Club is an exclusive community of independent restaurant owners and professionals. Join today. Message and data rates may apply. Please check our website for our terms of service and privacy policy. We also want to thank our sponsor, Hillcrest Food Service. If you're a local independent restaurant and are looking for a distributor who has chef and operational consulting, provides marketing support, does menu reviews, and most importantly, wants you to be successful, reach out to Hillcrest Food Service at hillcrestfoods.com.